Hello, this is our final supplemental video to our Hinduism section of the course. And in this one, we're going to be talking about the consorts of the Trimurti, the devis, the goddesses. We're going to be talking about the main devotional groups. We're going to be talking about different Vedanta traditions, and we're going to be talking about some of the most important reformers. So let's begin here with the slide here that you see on the Trimurti, and trying to find my mouse here. There we go. All right, good. Minimize myself into the corner here. We've already talked about the Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and we've talked about, every aspect that you need to know, but we have not talked about their main consorts. Now, of course, just like the gods, there are many, many goddesses, but these are the most important ones to know about because they are the consorts for the Trimurti. Now, Brahma, again, highly revered, not so much thought of as a god, as a personal god, that you would devote yourself to, because, again, he's a creator of universes, not quite as relevant to what we go through every day. But his consort, Sarasvati, is actually probably more worshipped than he is. Sometimes the V that you see there will actually be a W. V's and W's kind of transliterate there. For Vishnu, the superstar goddess is Lakshmi. And anyone who worships Vishnu generally is going to hold Lakshmi in very high regard and worship her too. There is another consort of Vishnu called Shri, but Shri is really understood to be kind of an incarnation of Lakshmi. So for many, it's the same goddess. Shiva now has four main goddesses that are very, very important. Shakti, Parvati, Durga, and Kali. Parvati is more the nurturing mother goddess. Shakti, if you remember, was the original consort, probably the earliest idea of a consort all the way back in the indigenous societies of the Dravidians before the Aryans even arrived. So she's the oldest goddess here. Durga is kind of a badass, kind of a warrior goddess. Kali is, well, if you've seen Kali depicted, Kali's often depicted with a sash of severed heads or skulls. She often has blood dripping off of her pointed tongue or off of her fangs, and her eyes kind of popping out of her head like she's having a bad acid trip, looking for whose throat she's going to rip out next. And strangely enough, she's very popular because everybody wants to be a friend of the baddest biatch that has ever existed. So we talked a little bit about this in class, but these are the main goddesses that I want you to know about and identify and know, of course, which of the gods of the Trimurti they go to. Now, here's what's really important I want you to get. We talked about, let me give you two examples of what this would kind of relate to. We talked about the fact that all of the gods are manifestations of Brahman. We also talked about the fact, specifically about the member of the Trimurti we call Vishnu, this preserver protector god that is just deeply loved and worshipped, that he also has manifestations that we call avatars. And these are manifestations, or you might say incarnations, physical incarnations of Vishnu, as he involves himself in the affairs of human history for the benefit of humans. And so in the same way that all the avatars are manifestations of Vishnu, or that all the gods are manifestations of Brahman, all of the many goddesses are seen as being manifestations of that ultimate cosmic goddess, if you will. Now, there are a couple different names that are often given to this cosmic goddess. She's often just called the Divine Mother, or there's many different, titular names. But in terms of the most common things that she's sometimes called Devi, and she's sometimes called Shakti. The scholars tend to call her Shakti a lot. So Devi and Shakti, both of these terms have three different meanings. Now, you're not going to be tested on this in the exams or quizzes or anything, but it's important you know this just so that you can talk intelligently if you're talking with a Hindu who worships some incarnation of the great goddess, the Divine Mother. First of all, two of the three meanings of Shakti and Devi are really kind of the same. The third one's a little different. So with Devi, first of all, Devi is a title. Devi is not really a name. Devi is like saying goddess. It's kind of like if you thought about Christianity and you thought about Jesus Christ. Well, Christ is certainly not his last name. Christos in Greek is the equivalent of the Hebrew Mashiach, which means anointed. So it's a title, the anointed one. So if you say, I worship Christ, you're saying I worship the anointed one. It's a title, not a name. And so Devi is the same way. Now, Devi can mean, first of all, it can mean the great goddess, big capital D, the goddess of whom all of the others are manifestations of. But Devi can also refer to all of the different goddesses that are manifestations of the great goddess. In other words, you might say that there are many Devis in the world. There are many goddesses in the world, okay? And that would be kind of a small d. The third way that Devi can be used is a title for your personal goddess, kind of the same way someone who worships Jesus might call him Christ. Makes sense? So nobody would say this is kind of silly, but just to get the three meanings, you would say, for instance, my Devi is one of the Devis of Devi, which again makes no sense, but those are kind of the three aspects of the term. Okay, Devi could be a title you refer to your personal goddess. Devi can be just a generic term for any goddess. There's many Devis. Or Devi can refer to that ultimate, transcendent great goddess that all of the other Devis are manifestations of. Now, the term Shakti can be used similarly. Two of the ways it can be used is Shakti, and scholars often do this. They will talk about the great divine goddess in terms of this being Shakti, the great Shakti. And so in this case, Shakti would be the goddess that all goddesses are manifestations of. The second way that Shakti can be used, and this is maybe a little bit rarer, but it is sometimes, you'll see scholars saying that there are many Shaktis in the world. So just the way there's many Devis, there's many goddesses, you could use kind of small s Shakti to say there's many Shaktis, many goddesses in the world. Now, the third way that Shakti is used is the one that's different than Devi. Because while you might use Devi as a title to refer to your personal goddess, with Shakti, you might actually worship the personal goddess Shakti, the goddess named Shakti, who is one of the Shaktis of the great Shakti. And again, that's kind of silly. Nobody would use it in that way, but just to get the three meanings across. And again, I'm not testing you on this, but just so you could, talk intelligently. So if you asked a Hindu and said, well, your bhakti, who is your personal, deity? And they say, oh, I worship Devi. What would your next question be? Obviously, which Devi, do you worship? Does that make sense? Good. I hear a yes. Okay, good. So moving on here, there are three main devotional groups in Hinduism. Now, of course, there's many, because there's thousands of gods. But if you want to talk about the three largest groups, we already know that two of them are going to be those that worship Vishnu and those that worship Shiva, right? So when we talk about those who worship Vishnu, we call them Vaishnavas. When we talk about those who worship Shiva, we call them Shaivas. Now, sometimes you'll see people saying Vaishnavites or Shaivites, but that kind of sounds like some kind of a disease or something. Vaishnavas and Shaivas are the ways that I usually talk about them. The third great group is anybody who worships an incarnation of the great goddess called Devi, Shakti, Mahadevi, and they could be the incarnations that are known as Parvata, Durgi, Kali, Lakshmi, Sarasvati, or some other Devi form. Hopefully everybody is with me so far. So these are the three major groups, and there are major holidays worshiping the great goddess, and we have two of them listed there. I'm not going to ask you about them in the exam. If anything, you might just see the names, and it might ask you, what are these? Are these goddesses? Are these holidays? Are these new RVs released in 2021? And obviously, these are holidays worshiping the great goddess. Diwali is mainly the worship of Lakshmi, but Navaratri is the worship of the great goddess in all three of what are considered to be her greatest forms. Durga as the consort, of course, of Shiva, Lakshmi as the consort of Vishnu, and Sarasvati as the consort of Brahma. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here is tantrism. Tantrism is a noun. The original noun would be tantra. And a tantra is usually a writing, but it is a special way to conduct a ritual that, if conducted in the right way, is actually going to produce some kind of result. Okay, so this is different than a ritual you do just to commemorate or memorialize something. It's different than a ritual you do just to get yourself in the right frame of mind or heart to be open to a great religious experience. It is a ritual that really, it's kind of magic. I mean, if you do it in the right way, the ritual itself has the power to affect something. Okay, so when we say tantric, we mean a ritual that is based on a tantra, a ritual that is thought to have power in itself to produce something. Okay? Tantrism is another noun, and it refers to just the kind of religion that involves tantric rituals, rituals that are described in tantras. Now, when we say that a religion is tantric, we're saying that it's very ritually based. Now, this does not just mean it has a lot of rituals. There are many religions that have many rituals that we would not call tantric because they don't see the rituals as being some kind of a magical ritual that actually does something in itself. Now, let me give you an example. We're going to leave Hinduism for a second. And since most of you understand monotheism better, let me give you an example of a ritual that in two different forms of Christianity is considered differently. The ritual was originally called the Lord's Supper, and it was a blessing that was done before a meal on a Shabbat, on a Sabbath. But as Christianity became more of a Gentile religion, in other words, a non-Jewish tradition, and the Gentiles accepting Jesus as their Savior had never really had this kind of a Shabbat blessing on the meals, it turned into rituals that were not necessarily done at the beginning of a meal, but were usually done at the church or cathedral or whatever when you came together for a mass or a meeting. And in Catholicism, it's usually called Holy Eucharist. And in Protestantism, it's Holy Communion. Now, there's a difference in the way Protestants and Catholics see these rituals. For Catholics, Holy Eucharist actually is what we call a sacrament. It's a ritual through which salvation comes, justification comes, acceptance by God comes. By performing this ritual, you are accepted in the body of Christ. And so the ritual does have power in itself to produce this effect. Okay? Now, Protestants would not see it that way. When they practice Holy Communion, which is the same thing, they do not see the ritual as being magic or having power in itself, but they do see it as being very important. And if you enter into the ritual with the right frame of mind, it actually opens you up to where you personally might be able to experience a special transformative experience of the presence of God in your life. And obviously people would be hoping for that. But if that happened, a Protestant would not say that that's because the ritual had the power to make that happen. They would say that in engaging the ritual with the right mindset, they experienced an intimate transformation. But again, the power's not in the ritual itself. You could look at it also in another way in terms of making pilgrimage to holy sites. Say you went to Capernaum in Israel, where we have the foundations of the house where Jesus actually lived with Simon Peter and his brother Andrew and their extended families, and out of which they conducted their fishing business from the Sea of Galilee. Whether a Protestant or Catholic, you might go there and have a very deeply spiritual experience. But a Protestant would not say that the place itself is magic, that there's some kind of residual power or virtue or miraculous, whatever, that is affecting you when you get close to it. Protestant would say that by being there, it's a point of faith for you. And in some way, it might actualize your faith and cause you to be more in a frame of mind or spirit where you could have a spiritual experience. But they wouldn't say it was because the place was magic or it had some special energy, whereas that is exactly what a Catholic would probably believe. So I've used this to show you how Catholics and Protestants in two different ways might have the same ritual, but a Catholic would see it more as a ritual that God has willed, that it has power in itself to affect you, where a Protestant would say, no, the ritual is something you enter into to put yourself in the right kind of mindset so you could have this experience with God. Hopefully that kind of explains the difference. Now, we would not call Catholicism tantric just because it's more ritually based. We tend to call it sacramental. Sacramental is more of an idea of the rituals imparting some effect, but not as far as tantrism. Tantrism is kind of way beyond this. Tantrism, in the religions that have tantric forms, Hinduism does, and we'll see also in Buddhism there are tantric forms when we get to Buddhism next week in our next section of the course. When we say tantric, we say ritually based, we mean that the spiritual power or the transformation that we're looking for comes specifically through the correct performance of the rituals. When you're involved in the ritual, you're looking for some kind of power, some kind of divine power that you are going to, and this is a good way of thinking of it, that you're going to kind of channel, if you will. In other words, the ritual is the conduit or the vehicle through which the spiritual power is received and through which you're changed. So let's talk about tantric rituals and the different characteristics of them. The number one characteristic is what I've just told you, and I hope you understand this. The ritual is, in a sense, magic. I mean, it's got a spiritual power to it that you want to be involved in. You want to have the ritual conducted in exactly the right kind of way, and you want to participate in exactly the right way so that you will get the benefit. And so the idea is that this spiritual power that is found in the ritual, you want to pass through you, which brings us to the second idea in Tantrism, and that there is a great deal of focus on male and female cosmic energies in the universe. Now, this has been around for a long time, but pre-axial age, before the axial age, when you see different kinds of rituals that involve reverence of goddesses and gods, and you think of them as having some kind of an intimate spiritual relationship, kind of like spiritual sex, in a sense, most of the time that you're acknowledging this, you're looking for some kind of fertility, the rains to come, something like this. And that you're assuming that somehow the god and the goddess together, when they have this kind of interaction, it brings fertility or blessing on the earth. That's pre-axial age. While some of those ideas hang on, during the axial age and after the axial age, the whole idea of male and female cosmic energies is a little bit different. And that is the energy flows from the male to the female. This is always going to be the case. The male is always going to be the more transmitting, dominant. The female is going to be more the receptor, You want to position yourself in this transfer of energy from the male to the female, and you receive a benefit when that power flows through you by being part of the ritual. Which brings us to the next characteristic, and that is there is much more of an opportunity for females to be involved in leadership of these kind of rituals, since you're focusing on male and female cosmic powers, to have those powers represented by male and female practitioners or priests, priestesses, whatever, is going to be a lot more likely in these kind of religions. Next, fourth thing, is there is almost a mysterious aspect to these rituals, if you will, and the meaning of them is something that is thought to not really be understood very much by people who are not that are not part of the group, and also what goes on in the group is pretty secretive. Okay, people that are involved in this, whatever distinctions you have in society, are really kind of dissolved when you walk in the door. This is a different kind of community. It's very private. And maybe some people might understand what the initiation ritual is to get into some of these, religious groups. We see mystery religions also in the beginning of Christianity and in the time of late Second Temple Judaism, mystery religions in the Roman Empire and so on that are kind of similar in this very private idea. So while you might know something about the initiation ritual, most people don't know anything about what goes on beyond that unless they're in the group, because it's kept very secretive. Now, here's the fifth thing, and this kind of goes back to the ideal of male and female cosmic energies and the transmission of energy between them, and that is both pre and post-axial age, for different reasons, as we discovered, because there is this tremendous focus on the transfer of power from male to female energies. Often, these rituals might involve some kind of sexual intercourse. Okay, so when you see rituals that involve sexual intercourse pre-axial age, with temple prostitutes perhaps, or something like that. Again, usually fertility is more in focus. Post-axial age, it's much more than that. It's about, once again, positioning yourself in that transmission of energy, and the ritual itself is the vehicle, or is the conduit for this transmission of energy. Now, not all tantric groups involve sexual intercourse in their rituals, but there are some. I'm just mentioning this because this is not strange at all. It might seem strange to monotheists today because we're so far past the period where this was common. But ancient societies, this is very, very common. So anyway, a little bit about tantrism. In Hinduism, there are tantric forms of the religion. And I'm sorry, didn't mean to go yet. To the next slide. There are actually archaeological ruins of, I think, 10 different temples in a certain area of India that were involved in this kind of thing. And 2 of the ones that are the best preserved, you can actually see carved in the stone depictions of different kinds of sexual positions. And some of them, by the way, require more people than the sexual partners. Might require a couple other people to, help the 2 partners maintain these special positions. And again, this seems very risque or very unusual for us today, but not so much if you go back a couple thousand, 2,500 years. Not so much at all. Let's talk about something else. First of all, Vedanta. What is Vedanta? Let's go back to when we were talking about different sacred texts, and we talked about that there are 4 Vedas, and that each of the 4 Vedas has 4 categories, and all of the documents that are part of these Vedas fall in one of these categories. And we started out, of course, with the Samhitas and the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, and we mentioned that the 4th part, the Upanishads, are the axial age writings, where we find this very new focus, more on introspection and meditation and philosophical realization of, the transcendent ultimate truth of our connection to Brahman, this type of thing. We talked about what was really new in the axial age in India, which we called monism. And it's a form of monotheism that believes that all of the different gods are manifestations of the one ultimate God. And we talked about the fact that this one ultimate God, normally called Brahman, is a monistic ultimate reality. In other words, every way we think is dualistic. We compare things with things to come to conclusions. And this is why we can't think monistically. We can't think about just one thing. In fact, what makes something a thing is the fact that we can identify it as being distinctive from other things that exist. So monism is beyond human conception. But it's not beyond human conception to see the boundaries of our conception. I'll say that again. It may be beyond our conception, but it's not beyond our ability to see the boundaries of our conception. I see that I cannot think about anything that isn't presented in some kind of a dualistic framework, where there's one aspect and another aspect I can compare with each other. So I see my limitation. And in the axial age, this is when people don't see their limitations as being the end of reality. They see their limitations as being the limitations of human perception, and they imagine that there must be something beyond them, and they speculate on what it must be like. And this is where we get to all kinds of symbolic representations too, because if something is beyond your conception, then all you can do is use things that you can conceive of to in some way represent what this ultimate reality must be like. This is the case with monism. Now, Vedanta, you've heard of the Vedas. Vedanta is really kind of means the end of the Vedas, not the finish, okay, not the cessation of them at all, but in other words, the final conclusion. If you think in terms of progressive revelation over the centuries, finally the conclusion that you reach in the Upanishads, this is what people believe that all of the earlier Vedas were working towards all the time. But of course, nobody knew that at the time until they actually got to this final revelation of the Upanishads. So these truths in the Upanishads are thought of as the conclusion of the whole progressive revelation of the Vedas. So when we say the end of the Vedas, we mean the end purpose or the end meaning or the end conclusion, the final revelation that we were going towards, that we were being led to through all of these centuries. The kind that we talked about when we talked about Brahman being the only reality, and therefore when we finally obtain moksha and we're with Brahman forever, we're not going to be thinking about ourselves, our self-image, who we think we are, in relationship to Brahman. Why? Because that's dualistic. Anytime you say dualistic, you're talking about the relationship of two or more persons or whatever. And so when you talk about being in a blissful relationship with God forever, as we would in monotheism, that's dualistic. Because you got God, you've got yourself, you're two different things, and you stay two different things, but you're in the most harmonious unity that two different things can possibly have. It's the same way you might think of a marriage. When you say they've got a perfect marriage, you're not saying that they're so unified that they've lost their distinctiveness as people. You're saying two distinctive people that are different could not have any more of a unity than we see represented in this particular relationship. And that's the way monotheists think about this bliss with God. But if you are part of this new Vedanta that starts emerging in the axial age called Advaita Vedanta, you actually believe that when you leave this world, your soul, your Atman, is so swallowed up, so completely unified with Brahman, that the distinctiveness of your existence is no longer recognized. You are Brahman. You're a part of Brahman. And I mentioned this before, and I'm just bringing this back to your attention before I start this. I mentioned that there is one finite way that I've thought of that works pretty well to demonstrate this. Obviously, we're talking about a world beyond anything finite or definable or delineated. But if you think of the Pacific Ocean as Brahman, obviously the Pacific Ocean is finite, but it's so big that we can't even think about all the atoms in the Pacific Ocean. So it works. And imagine your soul is a glass of water. And so you attain moksha. And in the understanding of Advaita Vedanta, your soul, imagine me pouring out the glass of water into the Pacific Ocean. Will you ever get that glass of water back? No. Will you ever recognize it again? No. You're not going to say, oh, look, there's one of the molecules that was part of the glass of water, going. It's just part of the ocean. The distinctiveness of that cup of water is lost forever. Cup of water is not lost forever at all. It's perfectly part of the Pacific Ocean now. And that's the way Advaita Vedanta sees moksha. So that's kind of a conclusion. Now let me go back to the beginning looking at this slide. Now, you've got three different columns here. Advaita Vedanta, your book talks about on page 89. The other Vedanta systems are not mentioned in Fisher, but I want to show you the different varieties in terms of these Vedantas. Now, these would be seen as different forms of jnana, the marga or the yoga that is according to intellectual pursuit. We might call it, theology, finding through your ability to investigate these concepts some assurance of the reality of the unity of your soul with Brahman, which is what these jnana yogis would be looking for. So with Advaita Vedanta, Advaita literally means not divided. In fact, if you think of the word Dvaita, it sounds like divided. Divided, dualistic, same thing. So when you put an A in front of something, it means not. So not divided. Not dualistic means monistic. And probably the greatest scholar that has finally articulated the beliefs of Advaita Vedanta a few centuries after the Axial Age is named Shankara. And he affirms that the only real reality is Brahman. Brahman is everything. He's the only reality. And so as we talked about before, Atman is Brahman. I mean, my soul is identical with Brahman. The world of names and forms, we call Maya, all dualistic. It's an illusion. The human, in essence, is one with Brahman. And so this whole world exists simply because we cannot imagine a monistic reality. Okay? So it is an illusion, but it exists because of our limitations. So you could say, in fact, that Maya, the illusion of the material world, only exists because of our lack of perception, in a sense. Now, it goes on to talk about, and I'm going to go through these piece by piece, okay? Advaita Vedanta goes on to talk about Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman, we're going to stay in this left column all the way down first, okay? Nirguna Brahman is the highest truth, and this is the God, the monistic God, you can't even think about. This is God beyond all delineation, beyond all borders, beyond all personal attributes, okay? When we think of a personal God, this is called Saguna Brahman. And Saguna Brahman is the perception of God where we attach personal attributes, which we have to even think about God. So Saguna Brahman is Brahman as the object of human devotion, which we think about with human qualities, even though we admit that this is not the way it really is. And this whole idea of Saguna Brahman appears as the result of Maya. Because we live in this world of illusion, we can only imagine God in a way that this world of illusion, this world of dualism allows, which is thinking of God as a person. So for Advaita Vedanta, Saguna Brahman, it's not like Saguna Brahman really exists in that sense, but it's the only way that we can think about God, which of course has to be okay. So Nirguna Brahman, the monistic God beyond all, boundaries, description, human, personal attributes, is the real Brahman. But we, because of our deficiency, think of Saguna Brahman. This next section I'm not going to talk too much about or test you on, but for Advaita Vedanta, Jnana is going to be the highest of the different margas, and they would see karma and bhakti marga as leading to Jnana. Why? Because Jnana is where you go to the limits of your understanding and try to imagine a monistic reality beyond the limits of your dualistic thinking, and that's exactly where Jnana Yogi is trying to get to. Now, this is the part I was talking about before that's so important. And that is, in moksha, complete union dissolves personhood. There's no distinction of Atman and Brahman that remains. You are so completely unified that you're one. Good? Now, let's look at a couple other forms. Because if we go back to the middle form, there is another great guru scholar after Shankara that comes about a century later. His name is Ramanuja. Ramanuja is so interesting. Ramanuja acknowledges that, yes, Brahman is one. He's monistic. We can't wrap our heads around it. But he sees Brahman as being characterized by multiplicity. Okay? In other words, the distinctions we see in the manifestations of Brahman are not entirely an illusion. Okay? Brahman in this reality is represented in a multiplicity of ways. So, whereas in Advaita, you might say the soul is identical with Brahman. In Vishishtaidvaita Vedanta, which is like, you might say, a moderated dualism, the universe and human souls are one with Brahman, but every man is kind of a spark of God. And if you imagine a campfire, how there's a fire, and when little pockets of sap in the wood explode, the sparks kind of go in all different directions. That's kind of a good way to think about it. Now, God in Vishishtaidvaita Vedanta is Saguna Brahman. This is not just an illusion. Yes, in his ultimate form, he's Nirguna Brahman. But God himself becomes Saguna Brahman to reveal himself to us. And this is similar to monotheism, where the God that is beyond all of our conception humbles himself and reveals himself in a personal way so we can know him. This is very similar to that monotheistic idea. So Saguna Brahman is not just something we create. This is Nirguna Brahman's willingness to become Saguna Brahman, to become personal to us. So the Vedas call him Nirguna Brahman simply because he possesses none of the flaws of personhood. And again, very similar to monotheism. If you think of God as a person, then as a person, God possesses none of the flaws that mortal persons possess. So it's the same kind of idea. Now, the difference is that he's still acknowledging that Brahman is one, a monistic reality we can't understand. But what he's saying is that everything that we can understand in this world of Maya, Brahman has willed that we would understand him this way. So, understanding him in a personal way, the highest, should have gone down to the yellow before this, but the highest focus in terms of the different margas or yogas would be bhakti, which is on devotion to Saguna Brahman. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Vishishtaidvaita Vedanta jnans, in a devotional sense, are Vaishnava. They worship Vishnu, and they see Vishnu as the highest manifestation of Brahman. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the last class lecture on the Bhagavad Gita, where we talked about, I think it was Bhagavad Gita 4.12, where Vishnu says, all paths come to me. Even if someone doesn't recognize it's Vishnu helping them because they have a different spiritual discipline, if they're laboring the right way, Vishnu is the one that helps them and is glad to welcome them to moksha, whether they realize it's him or not. Remember we talked about that? I don't want to go over it again now, but very interesting. Anyway, so Vishnu is Saguna Brahman. In other words, when the unknowable Brahman, this is to a Vaishnava, someone who worships Vishnu, when the unknowable Brahman becomes personal, he becomes personal by revealing himself in the deified person of Vishnu. And then, of course, after that, in all of the different avatars. This is so similar to monotheism, in a sense, because in monotheism, we have an understanding that God is beyond all comprehension. But then we also have an understanding of God becoming personal so we can understand him. Okay? In Judaism, for instance, his proper name is Yahweh. So this is the personal God that he wills to be. Now, if you understand Christianity, Christianity goes one step farther and says that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, was actually a Mashiach, an anointed transmitter of the message of God, but that in some sense, Jesus is actually God becoming material and getting involved in the affairs of human beings. This is so similar to Vaishnava. They believe in this, monistic Nirguna Brahman beyond comprehension, but Saguna Brahman is what they can obtain to, what they can understand, and what God wills to be, and they give themselves in worship to Saguna Brahman, and also to all of the different avatars through which Saguna Brahman has revealed himself throughout history, like Krishna and Rama. And by the way, today Hindus who are Vaishnava will gladly acknowledge that, the Buddha, Jesus, all of these are avatars of Vishnu. I mean, you could actually be a Hindu and Jesus could be your avatar, your personal God you worship as an avatar of Vishnu, and you would be considered Vaishnava. Again, Hinduism is very, very welcoming of these kind of ideas. So in this case, moksha involves the blissful eternal union of the soul and God. Why? Because even though God is monistic, we were created to be in a dualistic relationship with him. And so for all eternity, God is willing to continue to reveal himself as Saguna Brahman, this personal God, where we can enjoy, still recognizing the distinction between the creator and the created, enjoying this perfect unity with God. And again, this is so similar to the monotheistic idea of being with God forever, as is the last one, which is Dvaita Vedanta. Now, Dvaita is the scholar that comes later after Ramanuja, is called Madhva. And he's very, very similar to Ramanuja in many ways, okay? But this is just exactly the way monotheism is, okay? In Christianity, for instance. It affirms human relationship with a personal God, and it sees man as the servant of God. Now, when you think of servant, don't think of, slave in that sense, but the idea is that everything that man desires, everything that man wants, everything man's supposed to be is found in man's connection with God. So all of man's focus is supposed to be on fulfilling whatever man is supposed to be, whatever man is supposed to do to enter into this relationship with God. So humans are separate and distinct from God, like monotheism, but they're entirely dependent upon God, upon Brahman, for their existence. Okay? In a sense, they are, maybe manifestations of the creative idea of Brahman, that Brahman has decided to give them existence, and they couldn't have it without their connection to Brahman, but they are seen as being distinct. Much like Vishishtaidvaita, God is Saguna Brahman. The Vedas call him Nirguna Brahman because he possesses none of the flaws of personhood. This is exactly the same. Also, what is very much the same is the bhakti focus on devotion to Saguna Brahman as Vishnu. See, Dvaita Vedantas, they're Vaishnava too. They worship Vishnu. And again, bhakti, the highest path to moksha. But here's kind of the difference, and that is Dvaita Vedanta is not necessarily even affirming that there is this monistic reality beyond what we can perceive. They're not going there. You can't prove it exists. So they're just basically seeing it in a dualistic sense, where we're experiencing a separation from God now. We're trying to find unity in this life. And when we attain moksha, we'll be perfectly unified forever, but still with the distinction of beings. So just like Vishishtaidvaita, moksha involves the blissful eternal union of the soul and God, retaining the distinction of persons. Make sense? Last thing. Got to kind of put your critical thinking cap on here. If you're talking about the different kinds of margas in this life, you would logically come to the conclusion that someone who, if they were in the Jnan and they were Dvaita or Vishishtaidvaita, they would be much more likely to be bhakti in devotion than someone who is Advaita Vedanta. Because if someone who is Advaita Vedanta, believes that all, idea of God is personal is kind of an illusion that we create, it would be less likely that it would be seeking full fulfillment in personal relationship with God in this world by being a bhakti Hindu. But there are exceptions to the rule, big ones, and I want you to get this. It is totally possible for someone to believe that Advaita Vedanta is the ultimate reality, and when they die, they'll have perfect unity with Brahman, but still in this life, to be bhakti, to be worshiping a form of Brahman. And a great example of this is a guy we're going to talk about on the very next slide in just like one more minute, a guy named Ramakrishna, who in the 1800s, that's the 19th century, he is actually a priest of Kali. Interestingly, he's named Ramakrishna. He's named after the two avatars of Vishnu. So I'm not sure if he came from a clan that normally was Vaishnava as bhakti, but he ends up being a priest of Kali, which of course is a very popular goddess who's a consort of Shiva. And but he's still Advaita Vedanta, even though he's finding great fulfillment in his personal relationship as a priest of Kali. He, as a Janan yogi and as a guru, is teaching Advaita Vedanta, the fact that the ultimate reality is monistic. And he believes that when he finally attains moksha, he will be so swallowed up into, Brahman that this blissful personal relationship, it will be transcended forever. So you can be bhakti in this life and still be Advaita Vedanta and not believe in a personal distinction of persons when you attain moksha. Make sense? Still, it's going to be more likely that Vishishtaidvaita or Dvaita are going to be bhakti, but there are Advaita that are bhakti. Advaita would be the least maybe likely to be focusing on bhakti as a marga, but many of them do. And one of them, as I said, is this guy Ramakrishna. He's a priest of Kali. He's also Advaita. He, from two different data sources, has come to an interesting conclusion. The first is he has many ecstatic spiritual experiences himself. Transcendent experiences with the goddess, where many spiritual things are revealed to him. And he also has been a scholar of the world religions he knows of, and he knows of just about all of them. Not sure if he knows about all of the tribal societies or whatever in Africa, but he knows about the major religious traditions. He certainly knows all about Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and Islam and Judaism. And based on studying these religions and based on these miraculous spiritual experiences he's had, he comes to the conclusion that we are all seeking the same thing. We're all looking for that same kind of ultimate unity. And because it is beyond our actual comprehension, our conception, we conceive of it in different ways. We have different symbolisms. We have different metaphors we use to understand God or to understand the unity with God that we're seeking. And the religions that we create have different explanations as to how we got separated from God or what happens when we get reconnected again or what eternity is going to be like. But when we argue about these things, when we fight about who has the greatest truth, we're really fighting about our symbolic interpretations of things that we can't understand. We're fighting about the religious, machines and communities we've created to adhere to our belief in something beyond our comprehension. And so what Ramakrishna is saying, we're all seeking the same thing, even though we may have different conceptions of how we're seeking it and what we're seeking. And so we should be helping each other rather than arguing about our different ways of conceiving things. So he is a great proponent for ecumenicalism, if you want to use that term. It's sometimes used in a smaller context referring to unity in Christianity, but in the broader sense, unity in all religions. Recognize we're all looking for the same kind of fulfillment. So he's a great guy. And one of his quotes that's really good is, there are many doors to God's house. Many ways to get into God's house. You don't have to come in, the south door, the north door, the east door. And other people have gone on to say there's many rooms in God's house, So God's house is bigger than all of our disagreements. Now, we wouldn't even know about who Ramakrishna was because he probably traveled a 50-mile radius in his entire life. But the reason we do know about him is because he has a very important disciple named Vivekananda. Vivekananda, his disciple, spoke at the 1893 World Parliament of Religions, which is a special event that was held in Chicago at 1893 at the World's Fair there, and has been held in subsequent years. Every few years they would have one. But this one, Vivekananda went. He was invited, as were many other representatives of different religious traditions around the world, to represent Hinduism. And so Vivekananda went and he talked to the very interested masses there about Hinduism, and he presented it as Advaita Vedanta. Now, he didn't go so into abstract thinking that he lost people, but what he was presenting is this idea that we're all really seeking the same. There's one God. We're seeking the same thing. Okay, there's one God, there's one ultimate goal, and we all long for the same thing. We spend so much time fighting about how each of us thinks about it, but we're really all looking for the same thing. And he was a hit. They loved him. And part of it was because he was a good speaker, he was charismatic, but the message really resonated. And even 100 years ago, a lot of people were very much welcoming a message that was saying we don't need to have as much religious fighting and competition as we've had. We have a good reason to accept each other and accept that we're on the same path. And a lot of people would say that this presentation of Vivekananda probably is the beginning of an increased popularity of Hinduism in this country. And since then, many different forms of Hinduism have become popular in this country. And unfortunately, I don't have time to really talk about them now because I have to wrap this up. Let's talk lastly about Mohandas Gandhi. We've mentioned him before. We mentioned him in terms of the work that he did for the outcasts, for the lowest in Hindu society, trying to get them better advantages in life, trying to help them by becoming one with them. And he left his privileged position and actually associated with outcasts, with Chandala, which he called, as we mentioned before, Harijans, children of God. And this is one of the great things that Gandhi did. There were three things that Gandhi tried to do in his life, briefly. And we've talked about this, raising the standard of the outcasts, the bottom of society. Secondly, is to get the British overlords out of India. India wants to set up its own government, wants to rule itself. And it took many, many years before the British finally cave and are willing to leave and help them set up a government and get out of there. But Gandhi very much was working for that. And so in these first two goals, he was successful. We talked about the legislation in late 1948 after his assassination that makes it illegal to discriminate against, Shudras or outcasts in terms of their qualifications for certain kinds of positions, government positions, whatever, their admission to institutions of higher learning, or their application for visas to leave the country. And we talked about this earlier. Great accomplishment there. The British obviously do leave India. The third thing that Gandhi was trying to accomplish was peace between Hindus and Muslims. You've heard the old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And enemies oftentimes in history will make pacts, will make alliances because they have a greater enemy of both of them. And they know that they need to be in alliance to fight this greater enemy. So in this case, the Hindus and the Muslims in India have both been allied in trying to get the British out of their country. But the problem is that once the greater enemy or the greater person that you're striving with has succumbed to your wishes, you've had your way, you've won the day, then these two groups that were formerly enemies often go back to being enemies and now go back to hashing out their own differences. And this is what happens with the Muslims and Hindus that are allied. Once the British are leaving, now they go back to fighting with each other about the kind of government that's going to be founded. The Muslims are worried that they are not going to have an equal say in the government because there's so many more Hindus. And Mohandas Gandhi is actually sensitive to this, and he proposes, well, why don't we make the first president a Muslim? He's willing to make great concessions to try and make peace. Problem is this: you may have people wanting to make peace, but if you only have a few people that don't want peace, and they have ability to throw a wrench in the gears, you're not going to have peace. And this is what happens. There are nationalistic Hindus that refused to make peace. I mean, they wanted, clearly decided that the Hindus are in control. And you have certain Muslims also that are suspicious and don't want to make peace, that they think that later on, they'll get the raw end of the deal. And so they want something decisive about their rights. So they're not accepting this. And so these people are going to keep on fighting, even though we're trying to make peace. And Gandhi numerous times went on fasts. That means you stop eating. A couple times almost to death. And the last time was because of the fighting between Hindus and Muslims. And the fighting got so bad that the British partitioned India. Pakistan is the land where the Muslims were going to be able to live without interference from the Hindus. And what is now India, the smaller India, is where the Hindus are going to live without interference from the Muslims. Problem, though, in the area that's now called India, there are many Muslims that have lived there for multiple generations. This is their whole heritage. They're having to leave their whole homeland and move to Pakistan. And also in Pakistan, there are many Hindus that have lived there for many generations. I mean, it was a part of India for so long that now they have to leave their homeland and move to this other section of India. And so there are these, it's kind of like a divided highway. There's people immigrating in two different directions. And along this migration, many battles took place, a lot of violence. And so Gandhi is fasting for peace. And finally, somewhat as a result of Gandhi's fasting, they didn't want him to die. There was a concession of peace among those that respected Gandhi, and a truce was declared. Problem is, there were nationalistic Hindus that did not want the peace to be founded. And so what happened is after peace was declared and he ended his fast, he's still weak. He's coming out to meet a crowd of people outside of his house that are there to honor him. And as he goes out to meet the people and he's talking to them, a man walks up to him point blank and blows him away and assassinates him. And so of the three things that Gandhi tried to accomplish, the third thing, peace between Hindus and Muslims living together in a land co-ruled by both, this was something he could not accomplish, and it broke his heart. And right at the very end, where there was a glimmer of hope that it could happen, that's when his life ended. So know the two things that he accomplished, know the one thing he tried to accomplish, he wasn't able to. Lastly, his inspirations. I want you to know this. We talked about Jesus as a major inspiration, especially the Sermon on the Mount. This was in one of our first lectures. The idea that God's favor rests upon those who are most disadvantaged or persecuted in society. Now, something you may not know is that the Russian writer, very famous 19th century Russian writer, in fact, one of the two most famous, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Leonid Tolstoy, or Leo Tolstoy, wrote many books you might know about, like Anna Karenina and War and Peace, but he wrote something else that a lot of people don't know about, and it's called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And this is, of course, not a fictional book, but it's a religious book. And in this book, he presents a lot of the teachings of Jesus. And when Mohandas Gandhi was getting his legal training in Britain, he was exposed to the teachings of Tolstoy, and he loved Tolstoy. In fact, they stayed friends until Tolstoy died. But Tolstoy is given credit for really kind of reinvigorating Gandhi's interest in the teachings of Jesus. And it is through Tolstoy that he went back to the New Testament teachings, especially things like the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus became one of his heroes. And so later, when he went back to India and he engaged in this campaign of peaceful civil disobedience, the teachings of Jesus, one of his greatest inspirations. Again, he doesn't like British Christianity much. And we talked about this before because it doesn't bear any resemblance to Jesus. And so when asked why Gandhi is not a Christian, he would say things like, I love your Jesus, but your Christians are so unlike your Jesus. And so he had, as an educated man, seen the transformation of Christianity over the decades since the time of Jesus, and saw that the Christianity that exists today, at least all of the forms he'd ever seen, the major one being British Christianity, didn't seem to bear any resemblance to the Jesus that he loved and the teachings that he was trying to live by. So certainly British Christianity was not a positive inspiration, but the teachings of Jesus very much so. Henry David Thoreau, an American example. He's also a 19th century writer, just like Tolstoy. Tolstoy's a Russian, of course, but another 19th century writer, an American, Henry David Thoreau, wrote also in the area of civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience, and Mohandas Gandhi was very much inspired by him. And I would encourage you to look up more about Tolstoy and Thoreau and learn more about them. Gandhi is also very much inspired by the Bhagavad Gita, especially Krishna's presentation of karma yoga, the idea that you devote yourself to a life of service. And Gandhi's not doing it on the side like a lot of people. He devotes his whole life to it. It becomes his lifetime purpose. He's also very much devoted to an idea called ahimsa. And this is an important idea in Jainism, but also in Buddhism, Hinduism, the idea of doing no harm, the idea of non-harming. And so these are the major inspirations, and there are some others, but these are the major ones I want you to know that inspired Gandhi. And lastly, when we look at Martin Luther King Jr., the pioneer, if you will, of our civil rights movement in America in the 1960s, two of his major influences were a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, and also Mohandas Gandhi. He saw Gandhi as a great inspiration. And so I do want you to know that Gandhi was a great inspiration to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who also, of course, was more inspired by Jesus than anyone else. And I think this is most of what you're going to need to know to pass your final quizzes and midterm successfully in the Hinduism sections. If you have any other questions, send me an email. I'm happy to discuss anything that you need.